Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The chapel smelled like lilies and dust, like someone tried to cover up the scent of something older, something already gone. I remember thinking that Sandra would have hated it. Too formal, too cold. She always said funerals were for the living, not the dead. And still, there I was, standing alone at the back, in black slacks and a borrowed coat, watching the ushers direct people to the pews, with polite little nods, like they were seating folks for a theater production instead of burying someone's mother. I'd never felt so out of place. Not when I moved into my first apartment with roaches bigger than my dog. Not when I showed up to my ex's wedding by accident thinking it was someone else's. Not even when Trevor first introduced me to his family and his sister Eleanor looked me over like I was a lawn chair with a broken leg. No, this was different. This was personal. I caught Trevor's eye as he stood near the front row, beside his sister. A row of black-clad relatives, and a woman I vaguely recognized as some kind of cousin. He saw me. I know he did. His eyes met mine for a second, and then nothing. Not a smile, not a nod. Just that polite public face he puts on when things are uncomfortable. Then he turned back to Eleanor, whispered something, and she smirked. That smirk. Like I was the punchline to some inside joke. I started walking toward the front anyway. We'd been engaged for 9 months. I had every right to sit up there. I had cared for Sandra while Trevor was too busy with work or too overwhelmed. I was the one who drove her to chemo and held her hand when the meds made her sick. I knew where she kept the good tea and what music she played when she wanted to feel young. I had every damn right. But Trevor met me halfway down the aisle, hand half raised, like he was guiding traffic. "Hey," he whispered, soft but firm, his hand on my elbow. "It's family only in the front, Em. We need to keep the space for, just family." My throat tightened, but I nodded like I understood, like I wasn't just sucker punched in the ribs. I backed away before he could say anything else, walked back down the aisle with a smile so tight it made my teeth hurt. I sat in the very back row, between an elderly man who smelled like menthols and a teenager playing something silent on her phone. I stared at the back of Trevor's head the entire service. Didn't cry, didn't blink. I just sat there, dying a little in the pew. The pastor spoke about peace, about letting go, about the legacy of love. And with every word, I could hear Sandra's voice in my head saying, "Bullshit! Legacy doesn't mean squat if you didn't show up when it counted." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. Instead, I folded my hands in my lap and pretended I couldn't feel Eleanor's eyes burning into the back of my skull like twin lasers of judgment. Then came the part where people got up to share memories. Eleanor read something dry and performative. Trevor talked about how Sandra used to make French toast on Sundays. He forgot to mention she only did that after she lost her job in '99 and needed a way to stay grounded. He forgot to mention how she hated syrup, but used it anyway because that's what the kids wanted. He forgot everything that made her real. I stayed quiet. What was the point? But then something strange happened. After the final hymn, just when people were starting to shuffle out, the lawyer stood up. I hadn't even noticed him before. Middle-aged man in a charcoal suit, glasses too small for his head. The kind of guy who smelled like manila folders and knew the tax code better than his own birthday. He stepped up to the podium, adjusted the mic like he'd done this 100 times, and cleared his throat. "Before everyone departs," he said, glancing around the chapel with an oddly serious expression, "there is one final request from the deceased. Sandra Williams left a personal item for someone here today." There was a pause. People stopped mid-step. Even Eleanor turned around curious. The lawyer looked down at the note in his hand, then up again. His eyes swept the room, and then deadlock with me. "For Emily Carter," he said, clear and calm. "Sandra left this for Emily Carter. Only Emily." I swear the entire front row turned in unison, heads swiveling like synchronized swimmers. Even the teenager beside me put her phone down. My cheeks went hot. My fingers numb. I could feel the blood drain from my face. I stood slowly, legs unsteady, heart hammering so loud I could hear it in my ears. I walked down the aisle again. This time, no one stopped me. I didn't look at Trevor. I didn't need to. I could feel his confusion from across the chapel. I could feel Eleanor's disbelief. Her little smirk was gone, replaced by something tighter, meaner, like she smelled something burning and wasn't sure if it was coming from inside her own head. The lawyer reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick cream envelope sealed with wax. It looked like something out of a movie, like a prop in a mystery story. On the front, in Sandra's unmistakable handwriting, "Emily, open when you're alone." I took the envelope in my hands, fingers trembling, and turned to face the crowd. For the first time all day, I didn't feel invisible. I felt watched, scrutinized, feared. I didn't say a word. I just nodded politely and walked out the front door, envelope clutched to my chest like a secret I hadn't agreed to keep. And as the door swung closed behind me, I swear I heard Eleanor hiss under her breath. What the hell is going on? I didn't know, not yet, but I had a feeling that Sandra, in her final, brilliant Sandra way, had just turned the whole damn table. I didn't open the envelope that day, not right away, not with the sound of church shoes scraping against concrete behind me, and Trevor's voice barely masked in confusion calling my name. Like we hadn't just shared a life together for 3 years, like I was a stranger who had wandered into his family's grief by accident, and left with something I wasn't supposed to have. Instead, I walked straight to my car, slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and stared at the wax seal in my hands for what must have been a solid 15 minutes, trying to decide if my hands were shaking from shock or from the way his words, "It's only for family," still echoed in my ears like a slap I hadn't seen coming. I didn't cry. Maybe I should have. Maybe most people would have. But I felt something harder rising inside me. Something sharp and old and familiar. Like the feeling I had as a girl, watching my mom pour out dinner for a man who never came home, muttering excuses to herself that she tried to feed me too. That same bitter taste was back in my mouth now, sour and metallic, and I knew something inside me had just snapped, quietly but permanently. It wasn't until I got home and locked the door behind me that I finally sat down at the kitchen table, placed the envelope in front of me like it was a loaded weapon, and took a long, shaky breath. The wax was already cracked slightly, just from how tightly I'd been gripping it. I remembered that seal from one of Sandra's old letter-writing kits she found at a flea market once, the kind with floral pressed paper and lavender perfume that lingered days after the letter had been read. She joked about writing a will on scented stationery, said it would be the first time lawyers smelled something other than fear and ink. When I finally broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside, the first thing I noticed wasn't what it said, but what it didn't say. No greeting, no dear Emily, just 3 short sentences, written in Sandra's tight, slightly tilted script that always looked like it belonged on recipe cards and margin notes in library books. Go to the lake house, go alone, use the key in the lavender drawer. I sat there rereading those words over and over, trying to decide if it was grief or confusion or something far worse creeping up the back of my neck like cold breath. The lavender drawer. I knew exactly what that meant. Sandra's hall dresser, top left, always filled with little sachets and fancy hand creams. The place she kept old cards, spare buttons, and things she didn't want her kids to see. It wasn't locked. She used to let me go in there whenever I needed a safety pin or a bandage. I hadn't opened it since she passed. By the time I drove over to her house, dusk had already fallen and the windows glowed with that soft, eerie orange that only comes at the very end of the day. Like the house itself was exhaling after being held too long. I still had a spare key. I never gave it back. And I let myself in, careful not to turn on too many lights, even though no one was there to complain. It smelled like lemon polish and something fainter beneath it, something old and wooden and sad. The lavender drawer was exactly where I remembered it, and when I opened it, the familiar scent hit me so hard I had to sit down on the edge of the bed just to breathe. Nestled between a dried-out lotion tube and a tiny velvet pouch of earrings was a small brass key on a purple ribbon. I held it in my hand, felt its weight, and knew without a doubt that this was what she meant. I didn't even question what lake house she was talking about. I'd never seen one, never heard Trevor mention it. But something told me Sandra hadn't meant for anyone else to know. I went home, packed a bag with a toothbrush, clean clothes, and an old sweater Sandra had once told me brought out the color in my eyes, and I drove. The address was written on the back of the letter, almost as an afterthought, like she'd known I'd need it, but didn't want to make it obvious. It was upstate, near the kind of sleepy little town where people still waved at strangers and hardware stores sold gum at the counter. Took me almost 3 hours, though I swear it felt like 5. Or maybe 3. I'm bad at time when I'm anxious. Like back in college when I thought a 30-minute nap would fix an all-nighter and woke up 8 hours later, missing 2 exams and a date with a guy I ended up marrying for 2 years. You know, I still say it's weird how 3 hours can feel like 10 when you're dreading what comes next. When I arrived, the road narrowed until it turned into gravel, and then the gravel disappeared into mossy earth that crunched beneath my tires. Trees towered overhead like silent witnesses, and the moon was low enough to reflect in the dark water just beyond a thin line of reeds. The house itself wasn't large or fancy, more like an old fisherman's cottage, faded blue paint peeling at the corners, porch swing barely hanging on. And yet it felt intentional, like every broken shutter and cracked stone was exactly how it was supposed to be. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and something in my chest shifted. It wasn't the photos that got me, though they nearly did. Framed pictures on every shelf, every wall, photos of me and Sandra in moments I'd forgotten even happened. One of us in the kitchen, both of us laughing, flour on my nose. Another by the pier, her arm looped through mine, sunglasses too big for her face. But no, what got me wasn't the photos. It was the note sitting square in the middle of the dining room table, a fresh cup of lavender tea still steeping beside it like someone had just left the room. The air smelled like her. The note was folded twice, sealed with a wax stamp again, and this time it read, "Emily, for you, and only you." I didn't open it yet. I just sat down, stared at the steaming cup beside it, and felt my hands stop shaking. I didn't know what Sandra had done, but I had a feeling it was the kind of thing that couldn't be undone, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long while. Not grief, not rage, not even betrayal. I felt purpose. Because this wasn't about grief anymore. It was about truth. And from the look of things, Sandra had left me one hell of a truth to carry. The first thing I noticed when I woke up the next morning was how quiet everything felt. Not the kind of silence that creeps in after a long night in the city, but a deep, almost sacred stillness that wraps around your skin like wool. As though even the birds had agreed to keep their voices down until I figured out what the hell was happening. I hadn't slept much, maybe 2 or 3 hours at best, though I lay in bed longer, staring at the slanted wooden ceiling above me, listening to the groan of the floorboards with every small shift of my weight. As if the house was watching me too, waiting to see what I'd do next. It felt lived in, preserved in time, like Sandra had been here just yesterday baking one of those pear tarts she always made from memory. The kind with the perfectly imperfect crust and too much cinnamon because she said it covered up the taste of bruised fruit. I got up slowly, pulled the old cardigan tighter around me, and padded into the kitchen barefoot, drawn by the scent of lavender and something more subtle underneath, something smoky like burnt cedar or a faint candle long extinguished. The house was simple, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, and a wraparound porch that creaked in the wind like an old man settling into a rocker. Everything about it felt intentional, even the chipped ceramic mug sitting by the sink, half filled with rainwater, as though someone had placed it there to collect stories from the storm. I didn't touch the envelope right away, the one that still sat unopened in the center of the table with my name written across the front like a dare, like a final breath Sandra had saved just for me. Instead, I wandered through the house, taking in every detail, every forgotten coat hook and dusty bookshelf, the small collection of cookbooks stacked beside the fireplace, all of them dog-eared and loved to death. It was a home, not a property, one with stories in the floorboards and memory etched into the smudges on the window panes. And it was mine now, apparently, though I still hadn't wrapped my head around that part yet. When I finally returned to the table, I sat down carefully, as if the letter might explode in my hands or say something so final it would leave a mark on my skin. The wax seal cracked easily under my thumb, and I unfolded the paper slowly, bracing myself for whatever Sandra had decided to tell me from the grave. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind of penmanship that suggested a woman who took her time, even when time was the one thing running out. Emily, if you're reading this, then you listened. That's more than I expected from the rest of them. This house isn't in the will, at least not in the way you'd think. I kept it off the books, paid cash in '89 after my divorce, told no one but my lawyer. I used to come here alone when things got too loud, when Eleanor wouldn't stop judging me, and Trevor was too busy being charming to notice the cracks in everything around him. I brought you here once. You were asleep in the car, remember? That day I said we were going to the beach but kept driving until the roads turned to dust. I almost woke you up but didn't. I just sat out on the porch, watched the water, and wondered what it would feel like to belong to something without apology. You've always been kinder than you had to be, and smarter than Trevor ever gave you credit for. I don't know what you are to him now, but I know what you were to me. You listened, you stayed. You didn't turn away when I got small and bitter and tired of pretending I was stronger than I felt. You showed up. That matters more than blood ever did. There's a second letter. It's in the back closet, taped under the bottom shelf behind the old quilt. You'll know when to read it. And Emily, whatever they say next, don't let them rewrite the story. This is yours now. Make it count. Love, Sandra. I read the letter twice before I moved, before I even breathed deeply again. The lake outside was perfectly still, a sheet of silver glass that looked more like sky than water, and I thought to myself that this was probably what peace looked like, quiet, sturdy, and not asking for permission. I found the second envelope exactly where she said it would be, taped to the underside of an old dusty shelf behind a folded quilt that smelled faintly of mothballs and lavender, a smell so uniquely Sandra that it caught in my throat and made my eyes sting. This letter was heavier, sealed again with wax, but this time marked with a single word carved into the paper above the seal. Truth. I didn't open it. Not yet. Something told me that once I did, there'd be no turning back, that whatever Sandra had decided to leave behind was more than just real estate and sweet words in ink. There was weight in it, history, secrets, something buried under years of carefully managed silence. I slipped the letter into my bag and walked out onto the porch instead, needing air, needing distance, needing to remind myself that I was still standing on solid ground. The porch swing groaned as I sat down, the chains creaking overhead, and I watched the wind ripple across the lake in long, smooth strokes, like fingers brushing through water. I thought about Trevor, about the way he hadn't saved me a seat, hadn't even flinched when he pushed me to the back of the room like a stranger crashing a funeral. And it hit me all at once how little he must have known me, or maybe how little he cared to see. And maybe the worst part wasn't the betrayal, wasn't even the humiliation. It was the quiet realization that he'd never once asked me how I felt about any of it, never once looked at me like someone whose absence would mean something. Back inside, I opened the kitchen cabinet above the stove, searching for coffee, and found something else instead, a photo yellowed at the corners, tucked behind an old tin of loose-leaf tea. It was of Sandra, much younger, holding a baby I didn't recognize. She wasn't smiling in the picture, but she looked free, unburdened, alive in a way I hadn't seen in years. There was no date on the back, no name, nothing to anchor it except the expression on her face, which said more than any label ever could. I knew then, without reading the second letter, that Sandra's truth wasn't going to be tidy. It wasn't going to be neat and sentimental like a closing chapter. It was going to unravel something, maybe everything. And I wasn't sure yet if I was ready for that. But I also knew something else, something deeper and more urgent than fear. I was done being excluded. I was done waiting to be invited. Whatever Sandra left behind, it was mine now, and I wasn't going to let Trevor or Eleanor or anyone else keep their hands on it without a fight. This was only the beginning. And if Sandra had trusted me with her final move, then I wasn't about to fold. Not now. Not after everything. By the time the second letter finally left my hands, the paper worn soft from being read and reread a dozen times over the span of 2 sleepless nights, I was no longer the woman who sat in the back pew of Sandra's funeral like a discarded accessory, smiling politely through public humiliation while Trevor pretended I was nobody. And Eleanor smirked with the kind of satisfaction that only ever comes from long-brewed jealousy and the comforting lie of superiority. Something in me had shifted. Cracked open, maybe, like a dam that could no longer contain the rising flood of old disappointments and quiet betrayals I'd let slide in the name of love, of peace, of not making waves in someone else's carefully curated life. That letter didn't just tell me what I already suspected. It laid it bare, in Sandra's calm, unflinching tone, like she was sitting across from me with her usual cup of lavender tea, saying the things nobody else had the guts to say while they were still breathing. In that second letter, Sandra didn't waste time with pleasantries or apologies. She opened with a statement so blunt it made me flinch, even though I'd come to expect her honesty to land like gravel underfoot. "They don't deserve it, Emily. But you do." She went on to tell me how, shortly after her second cancer diagnosis, Trevor and Eleanor began circling her estate like vultures, asking careful questions, under the pretense of helping, offering to take the stress off her plate, while quietly laying the groundwork to carve up her life like a pie cooling on a windowsill. Eleanor wanted the house in the city, the one with the stained glass windows Sandra had inherited from her grandmother, and Trevor, predictably, had his eye on the liquid assets, the investments, the savings, the mutual funds he once scoffed at when Sandra had urged him to open one himself years earlier. They hadn't asked about the lake house because they didn't know it existed, which, as Sandra explained in her tight script, was exactly the way she wanted it. She'd kept it off the books on purpose, paid for it under a different name, held it in a trust that Trevor never saw because he was too busy assuming she'd never outthink him. The last line of the letter wasn't signed with love or sentiment, only 6 words that lodged in my chest like a stone. Burn their expectations. Build your own peace. And that was exactly what I intended to do. I showed up to the lawyer's office the following Monday dressed like someone who had nothing to prove but everything to protect. Dark jeans, clean blouse, hair tied back, no makeup, no mask. I walked through those glass doors with Sandra's letters folded neatly in my purse and a silence in my chest that felt more dangerous than any anger I'd ever known. Trevor and Eleanor were already there, of course, sitting beside each other like co-counsel in a case they assumed they'd already won, sipping bad coffee out of paper cups and whispering in that way people do when they're too arrogant to believe they'll lose. Trevor looked up when I entered, his mouth twitching like he couldn't decide whether to greet me or pretend I was there by accident. He settled on a tight nod, the kind you give someone at a wake who made things weird. "Didn't expect you," Eleanor said, without looking at me directly, her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was trying to hold herself together. "Of course you didn't," I replied, setting my bag down and taking the chair across from them, square and solid like I'd paid for it in blood. That's what makes this so fun. Before either of them could respond, Mr. Graves, the lawyer from the funeral, still looking like someone whose emotions had been filed away by decade, entered the room and nodded politely at each of us before pulling a slim folder from his briefcase and placing it carefully on the desk like it contained plutonium. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began. "There have been some late additions to Sandra Williams' final instructions," he said, scanning the room like he was bracing for impact. "These weren't part of the formal will distributed through probate, as they were held in a separate trust, executed under my private supervision." He turned to me. "Emily Carter, please confirm you are in receipt of a letter written by the deceased, dated February 16th of this year, and bearing her personal signature and seal. I nodded once, never breaking eye contact. Yes, I have it in my possession. Trevor's jaw flexed, and Eleanor sat up straighter, her hand twitching slightly like she wanted to snatch something she didn't yet understand. Mr. Graves continued, Then, per the terms of that private trust, the lake house located on Ashwood Lane, along with its surrounding 2 acres of waterfront property, is hereby transferred to Emily Carter, effective immediately. The deed has been signed and recorded. Additionally, the private account attached to the property's maintenance, valued at approximately $324,000, is now hers alone. You could have heard a pin drop. Eleanor's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like she was trying to breathe through a straw. Trevor didn't speak at all, but the color drained from his face so fast, he looked like someone had just announced the oxygen in the room had been recalled. She didn't even tell us she had a lake house, Eleanor snapped finally, her voice high and thin. How could she do that? How could she leave it to— She gestured at me with a handful of contempt. To someone who's not even family. She was my family, I said, calmly but firmly, the truth of it so deeply ingrained that I didn't need to raise my voice for it to hit like thunder. You just never noticed because you were too busy expecting to be the only ones who mattered. Trevor finally found his voice, low and hollow. You manipulated her, he said. Not quite accusing, not quite defeated, just confused in that way men get when the world refuses to orbit them. No, I said, leaning forward slightly. I listened to her. That's it. That's all it ever took. Mr. Graves cleared his throat again and handed me a small padded envelope, sealed with Sandra's handwriting once more. One final item, he said. Per her wishes, this is to be opened in private. She was very clear about that. I took it without hesitation, already knowing whatever Sandra had left in there wasn't meant to hurt anyone, only to shine a light where shadows had been allowed to thrive for too long. Trevor and Eleanor didn't speak to me as I left the office, didn't follow, didn't try to argue anymore. Whatever they had assumed would happen, whatever smooth transfer of power and inheritance they had imagined, they now knew it wasn't coming. Not today, not ever. And as I stepped out into the parking lot, sunlight brushing my shoulders, and the envelope pressed tight against my chest, I felt something new. A quiet fire under my skin. Not rage, not triumph, but something more enduring. Something like freedom. And it burned beautifully. There's something strange about silence when it follows chaos. Not the regular kind of quiet you find in the early morning hours when the world hasn't fully stretched awake yet, but that deep, ringing silence that comes after a storm has passed, and you're standing in the wreckage, blinking slowly at everything that's still standing and realizing you don't quite recognize the shape of your life anymore. That was the kind of quiet I walked into when I arrived back at the lake house. The padded envelope from Sandra tucked under one arm. The keys to a home I didn't ask for jangling softly in my coat pocket, like wind chimes made of secrets and goodbyes. It had been 3 hours since I left the lawyer's office, though it felt like years had passed beneath the skin of that day, and by the time I stepped back onto the creaky porch and unlocked the front door, my bones ached in a way that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with the weight of unspoken truth settling in places I hadn't known were hollow until Sandra filled them. The house welcomed me back in the same way it had the first time, with that faint, familiar scent of lavender and old wood, the gentle hum of the lake just outside, and an air of stillness that made every footstep feel like a conversation. I set the envelope down on the table where the first letter had been, poured myself a cup of tea I didn't remember making, and stood at the window watching the water shift and shimmer under the soft gray sky, knowing full well that the moment I opened that envelope, everything would change again. There was no going back. Not to the version of me that quietly accepted Trevor's coldness, or the woman who had sat alone at a funeral, pretending not to feel like an afterthought. Not to the part of my life where I mistook silence for peace or loyalty for love. When I finally peeled back the seal, I expected paper, another letter, another handwritten confession. But instead, what slipped out into my hands was a small USB drive, plain and silver, with no label, no markings, nothing to tell me what I might find except a single scrap of paper, folded around it bearing Sandra's handwriting, the ink slightly smudged, as if she had pressed her fingers to it just after writing the words. Plug this in when you're ready to hear what they never did. The air thickened as I slid the drive into my laptop, the screen flickering for a moment before a single video file popped up, dated just weeks before her death, and for a moment I hesitated, thumb hovering over the trackpad, afraid, not of what she would say, but of what it might do to me to hear her voice again in a way that couldn't be interrupted, challenged, or misunderstood. But I pressed play anyway because I owed it to her, and because something deep in my chest told me this wasn't just about closure. It was a door being held open, and I had to decide whether to walk through it or let it slam shut behind me like so many others I'd ignored in my life. The video began with the low mechanical whir of a camera being set down, and then Sandra came into frame, sitting upright in a hospital bed with a scarf wrapped around her head, and that same tired but unflinching expression she wore whenever she had something difficult to say. There was no makeup, no filter, no attempt to dress up the truth, just Sandra, stripped of all performance, looking directly into the lens like she was staring through time itself, through Trevor and Eleanor, through everything that had tried to reshape her life into something convenient and palatable for other people. I didn't have time to write it all down, she began, her voice hoarse but steady. And even if I did, I think this deserves more than ink and paper. I want you to hear me, Emily, not just read me. You've always been good at listening, and I need you to really listen now because the truth I'm about to give you isn't one anyone else has earned. She paused, took a breath that rattled slightly, and then continued with a sharp clarity that made my spine straighten. Trevor and Eleanor think they know who I was, think they know what I wanted, but they never really looked at me, not when it mattered. They saw the mother they expected, the woman they thought they could predict and persuade, but not the person I actually am. You did. You saw me when I was ugly and bitter and tired, and you never once turned away. She leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in her lap, and I noticed they were shaking just a little, not from fear, but from urgency. I know Trevor didn't defend you at the funeral. I know he let them humiliate you, let them treat you like an accessory when you've been the one person in my life who didn't require me to earn my place over and over again. That was the moment I knew, absolutely knew, you couldn't stay tied to him. He doesn't deserve you, Emily. None of them do. The video went on, not long, maybe 10 minutes total, but every second felt like it carved new space inside me, room for things I hadn't known I'd been starving for. Recognition, validation, love without condition or shame. At the end, she held up a small photograph, one I hadn't seen before, and the camera zoomed in just enough to show what it was. Sandra, young and free, holding a baby that couldn't be more than a few months old, with a man standing beside her whose face had been torn away. This was my first child, she said softly. Before Eleanor, before Trevor, I gave her up because I was young and scared and alone. I never stopped wondering where she ended up. Sometimes I wonder if that's why I took to you so easily, because part of me believed I'd found someone who could have been family if the universe had drawn its lines a little differently. When the screen finally went dark, I sat there for a long time, the soft mechanical hum of the laptop the only sound in the room, and I felt something settle inside me, not peace exactly, but a kind of understanding that left no room for doubt. Sandra hadn't just left me a house, or a secret, or a handful of poetic words. She'd left me a mirror, a map, and the permission to stop waiting for people like Trevor to value what they never had the depth to see. My phone buzzed not long after, and I didn't even need to look to know who it was. Trevor's name lit up the screen, followed by a message I didn't open because it didn't matter what he had to say anymore. Whatever excuses he was ready to give, whatever tears he might have mustered now that the inheritance had slipped through his fingers, it was too late. The door was closed, the chapter was sealed. And I was no longer the kind of woman who waited on the validation of people who only loved her when she was convenient. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and opened the mug cabinet to pour myself another cup of tea, and that was when I saw it. Tucked inside Sandra's favorite mug, the one with the chipped rim and the faded flowers, was a final envelope, smaller than the others, unsealed and folded twice, with no name on it. Only a single sentence scrawled across the front in Sandra's unmistakable handwriting. If you're still here, then you already know. I didn't open it, not right then, not yet, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't chasing answers. I had enough to carry for now, and some truths, I realized, are better when they take their time arriving. As I stepped outside and felt the wind move across the lake, cool and constant and filled with the scent of pine and wet earth, I knew that whatever Sandra had left inside that last piece of folded paper could wait a little longer, because this part, the part where I became my own family, my own future, had already begun.